So this is the second of two lectures on communication. The first one was about communication models. This is the beginning part, that was the beginning part of the lecture of different ways in which we can look at communication. This is on the other end. This is sort of like the concluding aspect to that communication lecture. The middle part we'll talk about in class. So I want to cover 5 basic communication rules or principles or guidelines. The first being that you cannot not communicate. This is called a communication imperative. The opposite of this is that we always communicate, or simply that anything is a potential message to somebody. So even if you say, I'm not going to talk to anybody today, you are still communicating to people because people have noticed your absence or they've noticed a lack of a text, and therefore you're communicating something. So whether you know it or not, we're always communicating. So simply you cannot not communicate. So I've just got a picture here of a couple of people talking. The second rule is that messages will always, notice the word always, undergo distortion as they get transmitted from one person to another. That's just a natural occurrence. It happens because of our psychology. It happens for a whole bunch of reasons, and I'll give you an example in class of how this actually will work. But just know that every message will undergo distortion as it goes from one person to another or as it gets transmitted. Part of that reason being that there's always noise. So I've got a picture of the earth with a bunch of human noise around it. The noise doesn't have to be external. There are basically 2 kinds of noise. The first is what's called internal noise, which is both psychological and physical. So internal psychological noise refers to sort of our mindset and where we're at, and the fact that, for example, if you're angry, it's really hard to listen to people. So your own psychology will keep you from being a good listener or hearing a message the way it was intended, either because you're angry and defensive or because you're happy and you don't care. There's always something going on, sort of we always have a psychological state, and that will always create this really odd filter for a message coming into your brain. The other internal type of noise is what's called physiological, which deals with the physical aspect. So if you haven't had a lot of sleep, you're going to hear things that are said to you differently. If you haven't had anything to eat and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if you desperately are looking for a restroom and you have to tell somebody, I'm sorry, I need to go find a restroom right now, all of that impacts how you actually hear and decode a message, or how you attribute meaning to it. So we always have noise going on. There's also environmental noise. So the other kind of external noise would be environmental noise. So if it's too hot or too cold, if there's noises outside, so literal physical noises that we hear. You hear a lawnmower at 8 o'clock in the morning. That is obviously noise if you're trying to concentrate on something. The other kind of noise, which would probably be placed under psychological, but it's actually considered a separate category, so I'm going to leave it as such, is what's called semantic noise. Semantic noise deals with the misunderstandings we have when we don't use the same language. So this could actually be a different language, or if someone has a very heavy speech pattern from growing up in another country and you have difficulty understanding them. This could also be semantic differences that we have just between generations. So when I use the word Genesis, it means several different things and different things to different people. So for some people it's a book in the Bible. For some people it's a really cool band from the 1980s. For other people it's the Genesis Project from Star Trek, which was one of the original Star Trek show. They talked about the Genesis Project. It also means beginning, and any host of any other number of things that are out there when we refer to the word Genesis. So semantic refers to the words and how we can get caught up or confused by the words that are actually being used. The 4th rule out of 5 is the thought that communication has both a content level and a relational level. In other words, the content in this little picture here on the left, the content is everything that's above the 4 people that are talking. So it's the messages, it's all the information you want to give somebody. But the other part of communication deals with the relational level, which really refers to the relationship that we have with people. So when you communicate to someone, you could say the same thing to different people and they would hear it differently. So if your parent says to you, close the door, you hear that as a command. But if you're in a store and your coworker says, close the door, you hear it very differently. And in part because of the relationship that the two of you have, also the context that you're in a different situation, so that's going to change it as well. If someone says be quiet, in one situation, they're going to hear those words. Content may be the same, but they'll hear those words very differently in a different context. So if you hear those words, I don't know, at some loud event, that means one thing, but if you're in a library, you know that you're being scolded for being too loud. So that's what that rule refers to, is that we've always got those two things going on side by side. The final rule, or the principle of communication, and there are, of course, like I said, many more, but these 5 seem to suffice, is that communication is both a psychological and a physical activity, meaning that psychologically it is very demanding and challenging to pay attention, to eliminate your own self-talk or whatever's going on in your head. And also it's a fairly challenging physical activity when you're really listening to somebody. And you might have noticed this if you've ever had a friend who's come to you with a problem, and after the conversation you feel rather exhausted. It's because your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, that when you communicate, it has a physiological effect on you. And of course, add emotions on that, you can see that that's quite obvious, that if you're arguing with somebody, yes, there's a psychological impact and also a physical impact in terms of blood pressure, heart rate, and everything else that I mentioned. So these are the 5 rules. This is what we would be ending this discussion with regard to communication. And like I said, the middle part that talks about the various parts of the model, we will talk about in class.